The Arctic is, in a sense, hasn't been a center point for where people have discussed domestication, especially in the field of archaeology. It's in a sense seen as a place that's been outside of the realm of domestication, as a place where domestication has only came to recently. So in that sense, it's kind of an unexplored, enormous landscape in which to think about domestication in new ways, with species maybe that have not traditionally been the focus of concern in domestication. For example, reindeer would be a great example of this. We know nothing about the domestication of reindeer and how the many traditions of living with reindeer developed in the Arctic. Archaeologists, are interested in social relationships and have studied social relationships among people for a long time. But there's been much less research on understanding people's relationships with animals. But this is, I think, very readable in the archaeological record through detailed study of skeletons. So, for example, we might find a dog that has been buried, and we can ask ourselves, well, what was the life history of that animal? How can we look at evidence in its body for its working relationships with people? In other words, did the dog engage with people in daily tasks like hunting or carrying burdens or pulling sleds and all these kind of things? And this might be manifest in things like changes in the animal skeleton through its life, wear and tear on the skeleton that results from being engaged in really strenuous activities, growth in the skeleton, and then other parts of relationships like relationships of violence, where people deal with animals in very brutal ways, for example, striking them to try to shape their behavior. So we can see this in skeletons through things like compression fractures in the skulls or broken limbs that have healed in some animals. And even extreme cases with things like trying to modify a dog's behavior, such as a dog's chewing and gnawing on things like traces or their leashes. People have dealt with this by removing the teeth of dogs, which is a really severe form of body modification that's done to modify behavior. And that's quintessentially a social relationship, but also a bodily one, and an embodied one that we can read through the study of archaeological materials. So we can see a range of social relationships between people and animals in the past in the archaeological record. An example of this would be our work with dog burials in Siberia, which in and around the Lake Baikal region date back 8,000 years ago. And in these graves, I think of them as really physical evidence for deep emotional bonds between people and animals that they spent their lives with, or that they came to be with. The animals, these very special animals, were treated just like people when they died. They were taken to a place in the landscape where only traditionally, or most of the time, people were buried, and they buried these dogs just like a person. They placed them in a grave. They buried them with items like spoons, or they put jewelry on the dogs, necklaces made out of deer teeth, carefully covered them and left them just as they left their humankind in these same places. So they were literally giving mortuary rites to these animals just like human persons. And what I like about this story is that it's a good example of a society where they saw so much continuity between people and some animals, rather than separating themselves off from them as categorically different. And their emotional connections to those animals were also very, very strong, and not so. Their emotionality wasn't limited to the people they lived with, but extended to other beings that inhabited their worlds.